for 5 minutes. Mr. Graves, did the gator get you?
Yeah, I'm just a flush wound, sir. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. So this amendment, what it does is it actually prohibits any funds in this legislation from being used for critical minerals to go toward the Taliban. Mr. Chairman, while the Chairman Grijalva earlier referred to Afghanistan and the heroes that served and made the ultimate sacrifice there as political fodder, I feel very differently. I think that Afghanistan has been an awful, unforced error that this administration has done and created an awful scenario there. When you combine that with the fact that this administration is carrying out energy and climate policies that actually advance the agenda or benefit countries like Russia and Vladimir Putin, it's really concerning that this could actually result, this legislation could actually result in further benefiting the Taliban and benefiting countries like Russia. So this amendment tries to address one of those. What it would do is, again, it would prohibit any funds in this bill, which I remind you is $3.5 trillion. It would prevent any of those funds from being used to go toward or benefit the Taliban through the acquisition of strategic or rare earth minerals. We're all aware of the reserves that are in Afghanistan that are now under the control of the Taliban or perhaps ISIS or Al Qaeda. We'd hate to see the United States funding their military as we're effectively funding the militaries of Russia and China under the auspices of a failed climate policy of the Biden administration. Mr. Chairman, I know that you're going to try and come back and want to refute those comments, but let's run through a few things here. So here you have number one: this administration has actually lifted sanctions against the folks that were building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and facilitating that construction. As you know, we objected, and the administration tried to come back and try and make up for their mistake. Still fell far short of what needed to be done. So facilitating Russian gas going into Europe, but then at the same time shutting down pipelines like the XL pipeline, shutting down pipelines like Keystone, and benefiting other countries, other regimes at the expense of American jobs. Now what's so just frustrating and confusing is that if we were actually supplanting all of the Russian gas with U.S. gas, it would reduce 70 million tons of emissions per year because U.S. gas is that much more efficient than Russian gas. So you can't call this far-fetched that this administration would continue pursuing policies that clearly benefit or advantage our adversaries versus sticking with American jobs, American energy, Americans' lower emissions, and American economic activity. So, Mr. Chairman, this tries to prevent the unforced errors that this administration continues to advance. I urge adoption of the amendment, and you'll.
Is there further discussion on Mr. Graves' amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I request permission to respond.
Chair Lowenthal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank Mr. Graves for his passion and raising the issue, which is very important, about what's taking place with the Taliban in Afghanistan. However, I really urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, which in essence is a procedural attempt to undermine our efforts today, which are to increase revenues from mineral resources to get a fair return for the American taxpayer. Unfortunately, if this amendment is passed, it will eventually prevent our ability to invest in our country and to build back better for all Americans. I urge a no vote.
Yield.
Yes, I certainly will.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Lowenthal, I want to make sure I understand the concern about how it would prevent us from building back better by preventing us from getting resources from the Taliban and perhaps instead using American energy resources. I'm just not following the logic.
Well, will you yield back? And I would like to respond to that.
Yes, sir. Yield back.
Yes, I think the question is what we have in the bill is an attempt to raise revenues, mineral revenues, for the Build Back Better bill. That's why we're here in terms of dealing with the budget reconciliation. Ultimately, this bit of your amendment will hurt our efforts to do that. And so I'm not dealing with the content of the amendment, but really it will hurt us. And because we're trying to invest in our country and build back better for all Americans.
Does the gentleman yield? All right, the gentleman has yielded. Is there further discussion on Graves Amendment number 29?
I'd like to be recognized, Chairman. This is Rep. Moore.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
And I just have I guess a question, and I'll maybe yield to Representative Graves if he can help me understand this. When we're saying raising revenues to build back better, are we talking about just giving money, like I don't want to say printing money because that's overly commonly used, but as we talk about this reconciliation package that is just increasing spending, are we saying that is what we're doing to raise revenues, or are we saying we're going to empower the industry, U.S. industry, to help raise revenues? That's a fundamental question, like a sincere question that I have, because we say we're trying to raise revenues to build back better. Like, I view it as, we need to enable our industries to be able to excel and have, the type of regulatory environment that they need to be able to go and actually, raise revenues. That's my understanding. But are we talking different terms here? Let me go ahead and yield to Representative Graves the balance of my time, and then if he wants to allow for someone to answer that question on the Democrat side, sincerely, I don't understand it all the way. Mr.
Moore is yielding to Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I appreciate your question. So yeah, I got to be honest. I didn't totally follow the logic for Mr. Lowenthal. I know that that he's an advocate of the legislation and certainly believes that increasing some of the costs and fees on domestic energy production helps to achieve some of the objectives in the bill. But I think that maybe we were getting our wires crossed. What is confusing to me is that our amendment simply says that you can't get critical minerals from the Taliban, which I think really carries over to ISIS and Al Qaeda and others, which would just enrich them to further challenge U.S. interests in Afghanistan and around the globe. And so, and as you know, Mr. Moore, we actually have some of these same rare earth and strategic minerals in the United States, including in the acting chair area of Salton Sea, that folks are basically prohibiting to be retrieved, therefore increasing our dependence upon China, potentially the Taliban and others. And so this amendment has nothing to do with raising revenue. It has everything to do with actually ensuring that the jobs, that the dollars, that the sources of energy are American energy, American jobs, American economic activity, not that of the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and ISIS, which I really don't care to employ. So I'm happy to offer time up to Mr. Huffman if he'd like to explain the answer there a little bit.
Well, I thank the gentleman for that time, and I will simply use that time to remind members that there are procedural problems with all of these amendments like this. I'm always impressed that some of our friends across the aisle have this amazing capacity to find linkages to the Taliban and Al Qaeda and the Communist Party of China and all these other things. I'm a little bit worried that there may be some staff out there playing a drinking game right now where every time these buzzwords are mentioned, they have to take a drink. And by the end of this markup, I'm worried about their sobriety because it just keeps getting said over and over. I wish that same creative linkage capacity were applied to the way our toxic addiction to fossil fuels is destroying our climate and creating a catastrophe. Because I think if you made that obvious connection that many of us are making, you'd be working with us to build back better and to make these investments that we're trying to advance today. So with that, I will yield the time, and we
And so
I'll
thank
ask
you,
if there's
Mr.
any further
Chairman.
debate on this amendment.
So, yep,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman,
Graves, the time has
thank
expired.
you. I'm actually not
So
going
is
to
there
still fill in a
further
minute.
debate?
So,
Is there further debate on amendment number 29?
Chairman, it's Westerman.
Mr. Westerman, you're recognized.
I'm not even sure where to start on this one, Mr. Chairman, but I was confused like Mr. Graves. If I understood correctly, the position of the majority is that banning minerals and elements from Afghanistan, the Taliban would that is critical to the success of the Build Back Better program. If that was the position I understood described earlier, but also, the link is obvious. It doesn't take a lot of logic to put the pieces together when the majority is talking about decarbonizing our economy and you want everything to be electric. Well, we know that you can't have electric without minerals and elements. Also included in this disastrous bill is $350 million to shut down a copper mine that could supply 25% of the U.S. copper for the next 50 years. So if we're not going to make it at home, we have to get it somewhere. Is that somewhere China? Is that somewhere Afghanistan? Is it going to be continually getting it from the places that China goes and develops mines like the Congo? So I think there's a definite link when you start talking about doing away with the reliable energy source of fossil fuels, and you don't want to look at how we make those fuels cleaner, how we all work towards a cleaner energy sector and a cleaner environment, instead of just thinking we can regulate it out of existence. And we know that
Really
what's
difficult because
already
we can't
happened is
tell
going
them
to continue to happen.
why we're opposing.
And that is that prices started going up, and the president's on the phone with OPEC asking them to increase production. So there's a way to transition. We talked about this in the markup last week. If we want to have a serious conversation about how we transition, how we can continue on the path of making U.S. energy cleaner like it's already on, or like it was on until this administration stepped in and started making irrational rules and not doing their jobs and permitting. If we wanted to talk about a true transition, then yeah, we're open to talk about that. We want to talk about how we can use new technology like small packaged nuclear reactors that are carbon free, how we could increase hydropower. Mr. McClintock already talked about that in California. There are a lot of ways we could do low carbon electricity, low carbon or no carbon energy, but that's not what this is about. This is about an attack on American energy, on American minerals, which is essentially American jobs, and it's shifting wealth overseas, and it's not going to do anything for the environment. As Republicans, we want a cleaner, healthier, safer environment, but we also want to have a vibrant economy, and we actually think those two go hand in hand. You don't have to destroy the economy to have a healthy environment. So that's where the connection is. It's all this talk about decarbonizing, about getting rid of fossil fuels. And we just asked a simple question: where are we going to get the energy? And if it's going to be electric energy, you've got to have copper, you got to have rare earth minerals. And if we're not getting them from here, then where? And it sounds like that where might just be Afghanistan. I yield back.
The gentleman has yielded. Is there further discussion on Graves' amendment number 29?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Ben's here.
Yes, Mr. Benz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to weigh in on Ranking Member Westerman's remarks about transition, because the failure of this bill, and there are many of them, but to understand the expense that a family has to incur in order to acquire an electric car to utilize some of the, I guess, thousands of electrical outlets that are suggested under this bill is just amazing, because most folks don't have the 15 or 20 or 30, $40,000 it takes to go out and acquire a new car. I only bring this up because, as so often has been the case in these kind of wishful thinking bills, there's all of these prompts, but little thought given to how the real folks in the United States are actually going to keep up with them. The prompt being, we're going to drive up the cost of your fuel in your gasoline powered or diesel powered vehicle before there's an alternative that they can afford. And no one takes into account the time over which transition has to occur. It's almost as though, hey, we're going to drive up the cost of your fuel tomorrow. We know it's going to take 15 to 20 years to flip the fleet from internal combustion engines over to electric, or for that matter, hydrogen, or whatever else the case may be. So I just wanted to weigh in on the importance of the concept that Ranking Member Westerman raised, which is, how do you carefully, thoughtfully approach transition? And so, and as so often is the case, people leap in to proclaim that someone's opposed to change just because you bring up the details necessary to achieve it. So I wanted to weigh in and say, hey, yeah, let's talk about transition. And with that, I yield back back to Mr. Westerman, even though Ranking Member Westerman, even though he may not want the time.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and I would yield time to Mr. Graves if he needs more time. I think he was trying to reclaim his time earlier.
Mr. Westerman is yielding to Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves does not appear to be with us right there. He is. Okay. I recognize Mr. Graves.
Mr. Huffman, I know you were sad I wasn't here. Hey, thank you very much for yielding back. Mr. Chairman, I'm so concerned, as I said in my opening statement at this markup session, that people are doing and saying things that simply aren't based on the facts. And look, I invite you, if you don't agree with something I'm saying, or if you have some other facts, I'd love to hear them. I really would. But the reality is that the policies that are being carried out by the very people that are sitting here talking about being concerned about climate change are actually resulting in increased global emissions. We just had this president out there begging OPEC to increase oil production. I mean, like, you can't make this stuff up. So you're increasing oil production. You are becoming more dependent, not just you, but forcing your allies to be more dependent upon oil from Vladimir Putin, resulting in higher global emissions, celebrating a Paris Climate Accord that results in increased global emissions, handing over the economic reins of the globe to China by allowing them to double their emissions whenever they're currently emitting more than every developed country in the world combined. This bill puts funds to Presidio Trust, which again is in the speaker's neighborhood in her district. Let's see, we're looking at some more stats here. Let me give you some other good ones. So not only are you supporting efforts to increase emissions, more dependence upon the Taliban, Russia, and China for energy, you also are putting $200 million toward, let's see, the value of one block of homes adjacent to the Presidio, which that block includes 14 homes, is $270 million. Look at that. That's just like average America, right? 14 homes worth $270 million. The next block over, don't worry, it's much cheaper. It's only 14 homes worth $220 million. And Mr. Chairman, adjacent to the Presidio, there are approximately 50 blocks of homes that have value around $200 million per block. Mr. Chairman, it is baffling to me what you all stand for, what your priorities are, and how in the world you would possibly explain this irresponsible, reckless bill to the average American, not to mention the guy who owns that place right there. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back to me. And I would just, I have the same hard time describing what the American people get for $32 billion. Which
Mr. Westerman, your time has expired, sir. And since we are now plowing through a lot of the same speeches and rhetoric for about the fourth or fifth time, I think I'm going to hold you to the clock. So
We'll get
Mr.
we'll
Chairman,
get
I would
number
yield
6
time.
opportunity.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield my time to Ranker Westerman.
Mr. Rosendale has yielded his time. Mr. Westerman, have at it.
We get to go number 6. Maybe you all will catch on to it after 6 or 7 times, but the idea that we're going to spend $32 billion in this committee, 0.9% of the 3.5 trillion. I think the Ways and Means Committee is meeting today to mark up over $1 trillion in spending, and Ed and Labor's got another massive amount of spending. Again, this one committee, $32 billion more than the state budgets of 27 states in our country. So what do the taxpayers get from it? And like Mr. Graves said, it makes things worse. It doesn't help anything. I can't think of one thing to tell my constituents back home, if you all pass this and God forbid it gets signed into law, that's going to make their life any better. And I don't see how you can tell anybody across the country that there's anything in this bill that's going to make life better for them. All it's going to do is cost more money, drive jobs away, and put financial burdens on our future. I appreciate the gentleman from Montana yielding, and I'll yield back time to him.
All right, is there further discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, the question then is on Graves Amendment number 29 to the ANS. I'll pause so that members in favor can unmute. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 I will now pause so members opposed can unmute. All those opposed, please say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I'd appreciate a recorded vote.
Recorded vote's been requested, and that will be postponed pursuant to our previous ruling. Mr. Graves, you have the next amendment